Eleanor Ellie Harper clung to the wheel, her knuckles white, her breath ragged in the pre-dawn gloom. The sea roared beneath her feet, a monstrous swell slamming the lighthouse keeper against an unseen wall of water. The storm had come out of nowhere, a beast of wind and wave tearing through Penobscot Bay, its howl drowning out her shouts to the crew. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the deck where ropes lashed like snakes and crates skidded toward the rail. She'd seen storms before, too many, but this one felt personal, a ghost of the night she'd lost her husband 20 years ago. Then, as suddenly as it struck, the tempest stilled, leaving an eerie, unnatural calm. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The silence that followed was thicker than the storm's fury, a weight pressing down on the bay like a held breath. The water, moments ago a churning chaos, flattened into a mirror, reflecting the pale gray of a spring sky not yet touched by sunrise. Seagulls hovered overhead, their cries muted as if afraid to break the spell. Ellie stood at the helm, her wiry frame taut, her silver hair plastered to her forehead from the rain. At 68, she carried the lines of a life etched by salt and sorrow, a third-generation fisherman who'd outlasted more seasons than most. Her hands, rough as the barnacles on her hull, loosened on the wheel, but her hazel eyes stayed sharp, scanning the horizon. She wasn't alone on the lighthouse keeper. Her crew, 4 souls as weathered and loyal as the boat itself, moved through the stillness, their voices low, their steps careful. Margaret Maggie. O'Connell, the first mate, coiled a rope with practiced hands, her dark curls escaping a knit cap. At 45, she was a single mother whose strength came from raising a son alone, her calm masking a fierce protectiveness. Henry Hank Sullivan, the engineer, wiped oil from his calloused fingers, his grizzled beard hiding a frown. Nearing 60, he'd spent decades coaxing life from engines, a man who trusted machines more than miracles. James Jimmy Carter, the youngest at 22, adjusted the nets, his lanky frame still adjusting to the sea's rhythms, his blue eyes wide with the storm's echo. And Ruth Delaney, a retired teacher in her late 60s, sat with a notebook, her glasses fogged, her pen poised to capture what she'd just seen. She'd joined Ellie to escape an empty house, trading chalk for salt-stained pages. Ellie exhaled, the air cold against her lips. "Everyone all right?" she called, her voice hoarse but steady. Nods and murmurs answered her. Yes, they were fine, shaken, but whole. The storm's retreat felt like a reprieve, but she knew the sea too well to trust it. Penobscot Bay, cradled by Maine's jagged coast, was a place of beauty and betrayal, its waters hiding rocks and currents that could claim a boat in a heartbeat. She'd fished these tides since she was a girl, learning from her father, then her husband, until the bay took him and left her with nothing but this boat and a hollow ache. "Check the gear," she said, turning the wheel slightly to steady their course. "Let's not waste the morning." The crew moved to obey, their boots thudding softly on the wet deck. Maggie hauled up the first net, her arms straining as the ropes creaked. Hank disappeared below to inspect the engine, muttering about salt water in the lines. Jimmy followed Maggie, eager to prove himself, while Ruth scribbled, her pen scratching like a whisper against the quiet. It was Maggie who saw it first. She froze, the net half raised, her breath catching in a sharp gasp. "Ellie," she said, her voice tight. "Look at that." Ellie turned, following Maggie's gaze across the glassy water. At first she thought it was debris, a log or a buoy torn loose by the storm, but then it moved, a massive shape breaking the surface, dark fur glistening under the faint light. A bear, a brown bear, its bulk unmistakable, thrashed in the waves miles from the nearest shore. Its head bobbed, paws clawing at the water. But it wasn't the sight of a bear so far out that stopped Ellie's heart. It was its eyes. They locked onto hers, wide and golden, piercing through the distance with an intensity that wasn't wild panic. It was something else, something that begged, something that knew. Ellie's chest tightened, a memory flashing unbidden. Her husband's face as the waves took him, his hand reaching, her screams lost to the wind. She'd failed him then, too far to pull him back, too late to rewrite the ending. Now, this creature stared at her, its struggle a mirror to that night, and she felt the weight of a choice she hadn't faced in decades. "What the hell's a bear doing out here?" Hank's voice rumbled as he climbed back topside, wiping his hands on his jacket. He squinted, then swore under his breath. Jimmy dropped the net he'd been holding, his mouth agape. Ruth stood, her notebook forgotten, her glasses slipping down her nose. "It's impossible," she murmured, but her tone wavered, caught between disbelief and awe. Ellie didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind raced. Logic screamed that bears didn't swim this far, that the storm must have swept it from some distant shore. But her heart, that bruised, stubborn thing she'd buried under years of routine, thudded with a different truth. This wasn't just an animal in distress. It was a plea, a chance, a thread tugging at the frayed edges of her soul. "Ellie?" Maggie's voice broke through, soft but urgent. "What do we do?" The crew turned to her, their faces a mix of fear and trust, waiting for the woman who'd steered them through worse than this. Ellie's grip tightened on the wheel, her jaw set. She didn't know what it meant. This bear in the middle of nowhere, its gaze cutting through her like a blade. But she knew one thing: she couldn't look away. "Get the big net," she said finally, her voice low, resolute. "We're pulling it in." The words hung in the air, a decision that would change everything. The bear's head dipped, then rose again, its eyes never leaving hers, as if it heard her, as if it understood. And in that moment, beneath the silent dawn, Ellie felt the first flicker of something she'd long forgotten. Hope, fragile and fierce, rising from the depths. The lighthouse keeper rocked gently on the still waters of Penobscot Bay, the silence after the storm wrapping the boat like a heavy blanket. Ellie Harper stood at the helm, her hand steady now, though her heart pounded with a rhythm she couldn't name. The bear's golden eyes held her captive, a lifeline thrown across the waves, tugging at memories she'd spent 20 years trying to drown. The crew waited, their breath shallow as her words. "Get the big net," Doteucht Bidik echoed in the dawn air. It was a command born not from reason, but from something deeper, a refusal to let another life slip away. Margaret, Maggie. O'Connell broke the spell first, her boots thudding against the deck as she moved toward the storage hatch. "You heard her!" she called, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She yanked the hatch open, revealing coils of rope and the heavy-duty net they used for the biggest hauls. Henry Hank Sullivan followed, his gruff mutterings about damn fool ideas trailing behind him. He knelt beside Maggie, his thick fingers working to untangle the net, his skepticism warring with the trust he'd built in Ellie over decades. Jimmy Carter hovered nearby. his lanky frame shifting nervously while Ruth Delaney scribbled in her notebook, her pen scratching a frantic rhythm. Ellie kept her eyes on the bear. It floated, paws churning the water, its massive head bobbing with a strange patience. She'd seen animals fight for survival, fish thrashing in her nets, gulls diving for scraps, but this was different. It didn't flail or roar. It waited, as if it knew they were coming, as if it trusted her to bridge the impossible gap between them. Her throat tightened. She'd failed her husband, watching helplessly as the sea swallowed him. But this time she could act. This time she could pull something back from the edge. "Net's ready," Hank grunted, hauling the heavy mesh over his shoulder. He and Maggie dragged it to the starboard side, the rope scraping against the deck. Jimmy darted forward, fumbling with the knots, his eagerness outweighing his inexperience. "Careful, kid," Maggie warned, her tone sharp but warm, like a mother guiding her son. She glanced at Ellie, a silent question in her dark eyes. "Are we really doing this?" Ellie nodded once, her jaw set, and Maggie turned back to the task, her curls bouncing as she moved. They lowered the net into the water, the ropes groaning under its weight. The bear shifted, its bulk a shadow beneath the surface, and Ellie held her breath. "Slow now," she said, stepping closer to the rail. "Don't spook it." Hank adjusted the winch, his hand steady despite his doubts, while Maggie guided the net's edge, her arms straining. The bear's head tilted, its eyes flicking between them, and then, to their astonishment, it stopped paddling. It floated still, letting the current nudge it toward the net, as if it understood their plan. The first attempt failed fast. The net caught under the bear's weight, the rope stretching taut before a loud snap split the air. A section tore and the bear slipped free, sinking briefly before resurfacing with a low huff. Jimmy yelped, stumbling back while Hank cursed, kicking the rail. "Too heavy," he growled. "We're wasting time." Ellie's heart sank, the sound of that snap echoing the crack of her husband's boat against the rocks. Failure loomed, a familiar ghost, but she pushed it down. "Try again," she said, her voice steel. "We're not giving up." Maggie nodded, her face set with determination. "It's not fighting us," she said, almost to herself. "It's waiting." She'd seen that kind of patience before, in her son when he was small, sitting quietly through her long shifts at the dock. She grabbed a spare rope, threading it, through the net's torn edge, her fingers quick and sure. Hank grumbled but helped, rigging a second layer to reinforce the mesh. Ruth paused her writing, peering over her glasses. "It's like it knows," she murmured, her skepticism cracking under the weight of what she saw. They dropped the net again, the ropes creaking as it sank. Ellie leaned over the rail, her breath fogging in the chilly air. "Come on," she whispered, willing the bear closer. This time it moved, a slow, deliberate roll of its massive body, tilting to one side so the net slid beneath it. Maggie gasped, her hands freezing on the rope. "Did you see that?" she said, her voice shaking. Hank's jaw dropped, his grumbling silenced. Jimmy stared wide-eyed as the bear settled into the net, its paws still, its trust absolute. "Pull!" Ellie shouted, snapping them back to action. Hank cranked the winch, the motor whining as the ropes tightened. Maggie and Jimmy hauled, their boots slipping on the wet deck while Ruth dropped her notebook to grab a line, her thin arms trembling with effort. The bear rose from the water, a dripping giant, its fur matted and dark, streams of seawater cascading back into the bay. It didn't thrash or growl. It hung there, suspended, its eyes sweeping the crew with a calm that defied everything they knew about wild things. They swung it over the rail, the net thudding onto the deck with a wet slap. Ellie stepped forward, her boots splashing in the puddles, her pulse racing. The bear lay still for a moment, then shook itself, spraying water across the deck. Jimmy flinched, but Maggie held her ground, her breath hitching. Hank cut the ropes, freeing the bear, and it rose slowly, its bulk towering over them. Ellie met its gaze again, and something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, a silent pact forged in that desperate pull from the sea. She didn't move as the bear took a step, its claws clicking against the wood. The crew held their breath, braced for chaos, but chaos didn't come. Instead, the bear sat like a dog waiting for a treat, and pressed a massive paw to its chest. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it extended that paw toward Ellie, its golden eyes locked on hers. The gesture was so clear, so human, that Ruth's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering to the deck. Jimmy's mouth fell open, and Maggie's hand flew to her heart, mirroring the bear's motion without realizing it. Ellie stared, her mind reeling. She'd fished these waters her whole life, seen seals and whales and storms that could break a man's soul, but never this. Never an animal that looked at her like it knew her, like it owed her something. Her husband's face flashed again, his smile, his laugh, the way he'd called her his lighthouse, and she felt a tear sting her cheek, cold against the morning air. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the lapping waves. The bear didn't answer, not with words, but its presence was enough. It stayed there, sitting on the deck of the lighthouse keeper, a wild thing turned guest, its fur dripping, its breath steady. Hank shook his head, muttering, "I'll be damned," while Ruth scrambled for her pen, her hands shaken as she wrote. Maggie stepped closer, her eyes soft, seeing her son in the bear's quiet strength. Jimmy edged forward too, his fear fading into wonder. Ellie reached out, her hand trembling, not to touch it, but to acknowledge it. The bear tilted its head, a low huff escaping its throat, and she felt it, a connection fragile and real, binding them across the divide of species and storms. She didn't understand it, not yet, but she knew one thing: this was no ordinary rescue. This was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. The deck was slick beneath their feet, the air sharp with salt and the faint tang of fish. The bear shifted, its weight creaking the boards, and Jimmy slipped, his boots skidding on the wet surface. He flailed, arms windmilling, a yelp escaping his lips as he pitched toward the railing. Ellie lunged, too far to reach him, her heart lurching with the memory of another fall she couldn't stop. But before he hit the edge, the bear moved, faster than its size suggested possible, lumbering forward to brace its shoulder against him. Jimmy grabbed its fur, his fingers sinking into the thick, damp coat, and froze, his breath hitching. The bear held still, a rock against the storm's aftermath, letting him find his balance. He steadied himself, his hands clutching tighter for a moment, then let go, stepping back with wide eyes. "Thanks," he stammered, his voice small, his face flushed with shock and gratitude. The bear eased away, returning to its seated pose as if catching a falling boy was the most natural thing in the world. Ellie watched, her chest tight, her mind a whirl of disbelief and relief. She'd seen Jimmy grow from a gangly kid to a deckhand, but he was still green, still learning the sea's unforgiving ways. That he'd nearly gone over, and that the bear had saved him, shook her more than she'd admit. Maggie rushed to him, her hands on his shoulders, checking him over with a mother's worry. "You okay?" she asked, her voice sharp but tender. Jimmy nodded, swallowing hard, his gaze flicking to the bear with something new. Trust, maybe, or awe. Ruth stood, her notebook clutched to her chest, her glasses fogged from the damp air. She'd taught kids for 30 years, seen every kind of chaos, but this was beyond her lessons. "That wasn't instinct," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "That was deliberate." She stepped closer, peering at the bear as if it were a puzzle she could solve with enough notes. Hank crossed his arms, his skepticism cracking like ice under a thaw. "Ain't never seen a bear play hero," he muttered, but his tone carried less bite, more wonder. The bear sat there, its fur glistening in the rising light, its breath puffing in soft clouds. Ellie felt the crew's eyes on her, waiting for her to make sense of it, to lead them through this strangeness. She didn't have answers, only questions piling up like driftwood after a tide. Why was it here? How had it known to help? And why did its gaze feel like a mirror, reflecting pieces of her she'd buried deep? She knelt, her knees creaking, bringing herself level with those golden eyes. "What are you?" she asked again, louder this time, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The bear didn't move, but its head tilted slightly, a low rumble vibrating from its chest. Not a growl, but something softer, almost a response. Ellie's breath caught. She'd talked to the sea plenty of times, cursing its cruelty or begging its mercy, but she'd never expected it to talk back. Not like this. Maggie knelt beside her, her hand resting lightly on Ellie's shoulder. "It's like it's thanking us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She thought of her son again, the way he'd hug her after a long day, wordless but full of meaning. Jimmy edged closer, his fear gone, replaced by a boyish curiosity. "It's not scared of us," he said, almost to himself. Hank stayed back, but his arms uncrossed, his stance softening as he watched. Ruth flipped open her notebook, her pen flying across the page. "March 28th, 2025, she wrote, her hand shaking. "Rescued a bear from Penobscot Bay. It saved Jimmy. It gestured. This isn't normal." She paused, looking up at Ellie. "What do we do now?" she asked, her teacher's certainty replaced by a student's wonder. Ellie didn't answer right away. She studied the bear, its massive form a quiet presence amid the dripping nets and scattered gear. The storm had brought it to them, a gift or a test, she couldn't tell. But as the first rays of sunrise broke over the horizon, painting the water gold, she felt a shift inside her, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. She'd pulled it from the sea, and it had pulled Jimmy from danger. Whatever it wasn't just a bear anymore. It was theirs. "Keep an eye on it," she said finally, standing with a groan. "We'll figure it out." The crew nodded, their movements slow, their gazes lingering on the creature that had turned their morning upside down. The bear settled onto its haunches, its eyes following Ellie as she returned to the wheel, a silent promise hanging between them. Whatever came next, she knew it would change them all, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the sea had more to say. The lighthouse keeper hummed softly as it cut through the glassy waters of Penobscot Bay, the dawn light spilling gold across the deck where the bear sat, a hulking silhouette against the rising sun. Ellie Harper stood at the helm, her hands steady on the wheel, but her mind churned like the storm that had passed. The bear's presence, its impossible rescue, its gesture of gratitude, its quick save of Jimmy, hung over the crew like a fog they couldn't shake. She'd pulled it from the sea, and it had pulled them into something she couldn't name. Her crew moved around her, their voices hushed, their eyes darting between the bear and each other, waiting for her to chart the course through this strangeness. Maggie O'Connell crouched near the bear, her dark curls catching the light as she studied it with a mother's curiosity. She'd seen it help Jimmy, felt its calm like a balm, and now she couldn't look away. Hank Sullivan leaned against the rail, his grizzled face set in a scowl, though his skepticism wavered with every glance at the bear. Jimmy Carter lingered nearby, his lanky frame less tense now, his blue eyes wide with a mix of awe and trust. Ruth Delaney sat on a crate, her notebook open, her pen scratching as she tried to capture the uncapturable. Ellie felt their reliance on her, a weight she'd carried since her husband's death, but this time it was different, less a burden, more a tether. The engine sputtered, a sharp rattle breaking the quiet. Ellie's head snapped up, her hands tightening on the wheel. She knew that sound too well. It was the same cough that had plagued her husband's boat the night the storm took him, a mechanical hiccup that turned deadly when ignored. Hank straightened, his scowl deepening as he wiped his hands on his jacket. "Damn it," he muttered, already moving toward the hatch. "I'll check it." He disappeared below, the clang of metal echoing up as he rummaged in the engine room. Ellie's gaze flicked to the bear. It shifted, its massive paws pressing into the deck, and then it did something that stopped her breath. It lumbered toward the engine hatch and pawed at a spot on the floorboards, its claws scraping with purpose. The sound was deliberate, a dull thump, thump, and it kept at it, eyes fixed on her as if urging her to listen. Maggie stood, her brow furrowing. "What's it doing?" she asked, her voice low. Jimmy edged closer, his curiosity pulling him forward. "It's like it's pointing," he said, his tone half question, half wonder. Ruth set her pen down, her glasses slipping as she leaned in. "That's not random," she said, her voice trembling with realization. "It's trying to tell us something." Ellie stepped away from the wheel, her boots splashing in the puddles left by the bear's dripping fur. She knelt beside it, her knees creaking, and watched as it pawed again, harder this time, leaving shallow scratches in the wood. Her stomach twisted. She'd ignored signs before, her husband's quiet worry about the engine, the way he'd brushed it off. And it had cost her everything. Not this time. "Hank," she called, her voice sharp. "Come up here." He emerged, oil streaking his hands, his face red with frustration. "What now?" he snapped, then froze as he saw the bear. "What's it doing?" Ellie pointed to the spot. "Check there," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Hank hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but he grabbed a wrench and pried up the board. Beneath it, a fuel line glistened, a thin crack weeping oil, a slow leak that could have sparked a fire if they'd kept running. He swore under his breath, his skepticism crumbling. "How'd it know?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Ellie didn't answer. She stared at the bear, her heart pounding. That leak, it was the kind of thing that had killed her husband, a small failure turned fatal in a storm. She saw his face again, his laugh fading into the waves, and felt a pang so sharp it stole her breath. Had she missed it then, too? Had the sea sent this bear to show her what she couldn't see? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was impossible, but so was everything about this morning. Hank patched the line, his hands quick despite his shock, and the engine settled into a steady hum. He climbed back up, wiping his brow. "Fixed," he said, then glanced at the bear. "Guess I owe it one." He tried to smirk, but it faltered, his gruff exterior softening. Maggie knelt beside Ellie, her hand brushing her shoulder. "It's like it's watching out for us," she said, her voice thick. Ellie nodded, her throat tight. "Maybe it is," she whispered, meeting the bear's golden eyes. They held a depth she couldn't fathom, a quiet that steadied her racing pulse. Jimmy grinned, his fear gone. "It's our inspector now," he said, echoing Hank's earlier quip. Ruth scribbled again, her pen flying. "It knew," she wrote. "It showed us. This changes everything." Ellie stood, her legs shaky, and returned to the wheel. The bear settled back, its paws tucked beneath it, a guardian in fur and claw. She didn't understand it. Not yet, but she felt it, a bond forming, fragile and fierce, pulling her toward something she'd lost long ago. The day stretched on, the sun climbing higher, its light warming the damp deck. The crew worked in a quiet rhythm, hauling nets, sorting fish, but their eyes kept drifting to the bear. It stayed near the center, its presence a constant hum beneath their tasks. Ellie steered them toward shore, her mind split between the familiar pull of routine and the strange pull of this creature. She'd saved it. And now it had saved them. Twice, if she counted Jimmy's fall. What did it mean? What came next? She didn't know. But as the coastline loomed, she felt the sea whispering, promising more. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, their edges bruised with the threat of rain. Ellie Harper adjusted the wheel of the lighthouse keeper, her eyes flicking between the approaching storm and the bear sprawled across the deck. It lay there, its fur drying in patches under the midday sun, its massive head resting on its paws. The crew moved around it, their steps cautious, but less fearful now, their voices a low murmur as they secured the morning's catch. She'd seen it fix the engine, or lead them to it, and the memory clung to her like salt on her skin. It wasn't just a bear anymore, it was something more, something that stirred the ashes of her past. Maggie O'Connell tied off a net, her hands steady despite the ache in her shoulders. She glanced at the bear, her thoughts drifting to her son, waiting back at the dock with his quiet strength. It had that same stillness, that same trust, and it tugged at her heart in ways she couldn't explain. Hank Sullivan checked the engine again, his wrench clanking as he muttered about freak luck. But his grumbling lacked its usual edge. He'd seen the leak, felt the bear's nudge, and it gnawed at his practical mind. Jimmy Carter tossed fish into a crate, his movements lighter now, his grin flashing whenever he caught the bear's eye. Ruth Delaney sat with her notebook, her glasses perched low, her pen pausing as she watched the sky darken. The first gust hit, a cold slap that rocked the boat and sent a crate sliding. Ellie braced herself, her hands tight on the wheel, her pulse quickening. "Storm's comin' fast," she called, her voice cutting through the wind. Maggie grabbed the crate, her boots slipping as she wrestled it back into place. "Secure everything," she shouted, her tone sharp with a mother's urgency. Hank bolted below, checking the patched line while Jimmy scrambled to tie down loose ropes, his lanky frame swaying with the boat's pitch. The bear lifted its head, its golden eyes narrowing as the waves rose. Ellie watched it, her breath catching as it stood, its claws digging into the deck for balance. The sky cracked with thunder, and rain lashed the boat, a sudden squall that turned the bay into a churning beast. A heavy fish crate broke free, tumbling toward the rail, and Jimmy lunged for it, too slow. The bear moved, lumbering but sure, planting itself between the crate and the edge. It caught the weight with its shoulder, a low grunt escaping its throat as the crate thudded against it, then held firm until Maggie and Jimmy could tie it down. Ellie's heart thudded, her hands trembling on the wheel. She'd lost cargo before, lost more than that. But this time the bear had stepped in, a wall of fur and muscle against the storm's chaos. Maggie panted, her curls plastered to her face, and shot the bear a look of stunned gratitude. "Good catch," she said, half laughing, half shaking. Jimmy grinned, wiping rain from his eyes. "It's got our back," he said, his voice bright despite the downpour. Hank climbed up, soaked, and stared. "That's twice now," he muttered, his disbelief fraying further. The squall raged, waves crashing over the deck, but the bear didn't flinch. It moved with them, its strength a steady anchor as they fought the storm. When a rope snapped, whipping loose in the wind, it grabbed it with its jaws, holding it taut until Hank could knot it again. Ellie steered through the swells, her eyes darting to the bear, its fur slick with rain, its presence a shield against the sea's fury. She'd faced storms alone for years, but this time she wasn't alone, not really. The rain slowed, the wind easing into a sigh, and the boat settled into a gentler roll. Ellie exhaled, her shoulders slumping as the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of blue. The crew gathered, dripping and breathless, their eyes on the bear. It shook itself, spraying water across the deck, then lumbered to a pile of fish spilling from a torn net. Ellie watched, her chest tight as it nosed a few scraps toward the rail. Seagulls swooped down, their cries piercing the quiet, and she tossed a fish to them, a habit from years at sea. The bear mimicked her, nudging another fish with its snout, sending it arcing into the air for the birds. Ruth gasped, her notebook slipping to the deck. "It's sharing," she said, her voice breaking with wonder. Tears stung her eyes, blurring the world into a watercolor of gray and gold. She'd taught kindness to children, but seeing it in this wild thing undid her. Maggie smiled, soft and sad, thinking of her son's small hands offering her half his sandwich. Jimmy laughed, a pure, boyish sound, and tossed a fish himself, joining the bear's quiet game. Hank crossed his arms, his scowl gone, replaced by a grudging nod. "Crazy beast," he said, but his tone held respect. Ellie stepped away from the wheel, the storm's echo fading from her bones. She sat on a crate, rain dripping from her cap, and looked at the bear. It met her gaze, its head tilted, and she felt it again. That thread between them, stronger now, woven through the chaos they'd faced together. "You're something else," she said, her voice rough with emotion. She thought of her husband, his laugh lost to the waves, and wondered if he'd sent this bear, if the sea had given her a chance to mend what she'd broken. The bear huffed, a soft sound that vibrated through the deck, and Ellie leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "I lost him out here," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. 20 years ago. Storm like this one. Couldn't save him." Her voice cracked, her hands clenching into fists. She'd never spoken it aloud, not to the crew, not to anyone, but the bear's steady gaze pulled it from her, a confession to the sea itself. "I tried, but the waves, they took him." Maggie sat beside her, silent, her hand resting on Ellie's arm. Jimmy stopped tossing fish, his grin fading into something solemn. Hank looked away, his jaw tight, while Ruth wrote, her pen trembling. The bear shifted closer, its bulk settling near Ellie's feet, and tilted its head again, a low rumble rising from its chest. Not a growl, but a sound that felt like comfort, like it heard her pain and carried it too. Ellie wiped her eyes, the tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. She didn't know if it understood, not really, but its presence was enough. It had fought the storm with them, shared their catch, saved their gear. It wasn't just a passenger, it was part of them now, a piece of the boat as vital as the wheel or the nets. She reached out, her hand hovering over its damp fur, then pulled back, not ready to cross that line. The coastline grew sharper ahead, the promise of shore drawing near. Ellie stood, her legs unsteady, and returned to the helm. "Let's get home," she said, her voice firmer now, a captain's resolve steadying her grief. The crew moved to their tasks, their rhythm slower, their glances softer. The bear stayed where it was, its eyes following her, a quiet sentinel in the fading light. The storm had tested them, and they'd survived. Not alone, but together, with this creature that defied every rule she'd ever known. Ellie steered toward land, her heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. She didn't know what came next, how they'd explain this, what the bear would do, but she felt the sea shift beneath her, whispering of more to come, of a story just beginning to unfold. The lighthouse keeper glided toward the rugged edge of Penobscot Bay, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the deck where the bear sprawled, its damp fur catching the light. Ellie Harper gripped the wheel, her hazel eyes tracing the familiar outline of the Maine coast, pine-covered hills dipping into the sea, a scattering of docks jutting like fingers into the water. The storm had passed, leaving a bruised sky and a boat full of questions. The bear had fought beside them, shared their catch, and now it rested, a quiet giant among the nets and crates. She felt its presence like a pulse, steady and unyielding, a tether to something she couldn't yet grasp. Maggie O'Connell coiled a rope, her hands moving with the rhythm of years, though her dark eyes kept drifting to the bear. She saw her son in its stillness, a strength that didn't need words, and it stirred a warmth she hadn't felt in a while. Hank Sullivan tinkered with a loose bolt near the rail, his gruff mutters softened by the memory of the bear's nudge to the engine's flaw. Jimmy Carter sorted fish, his lanky frame humming with energy, his glances at the bear tinged with a boyish grin. Ruth Delaney sat with her notebook, her glasses fogged from the lingering damp, her pen pausing as she watched the creature that had upended her world. Ellie steered them closer to shore, the hum of the engine a steady heartbeat beneath her feet. They were nearing a sheltered cove, a spot she'd used since she was a girl, where the water was deep enough to dock and the rock stayed hidden below the surface. She knew these tides like her own breath, every ripple and current mapped in her mind. But as the coastline sharpened, the bear stirred, its massive head lifting, its golden eyes narrowing at the water ahead. It rose, claws clicking against the deck, and lumbered to the bow, its bulk swaying with the boat's gentle roll. Maggie frowned, setting the rope aside. "What's it up to?" she asked, her voice low, a mother's instinct prickling. Jimmy dropped a fish, his grin fading into curiosity as he followed the bear's gaze. "It's looking at something," he said, stepping closer. Hank straightened, his wrench still in hand, his skepticism warring with the unease creeping up his spine. "Probably just smells land," he grunted, but his tone lacked conviction. Ruth adjusted her glasses, peering over the rail. "It's not random," she said, her voice steady with a teacher's certainty. "It's focused." Ellie watched, her hands tightening on the wheel. The bear pawed at the deck, its claws scraping shallow lines into the wood. Not deep scratches, but deliberate marks, a rough zigzag that pointed toward the cove's entrance. It huffed, a low sound that vibrated through the air and turned its head to meet her gaze. Those eyes, golden and deep, held hers, urgent, insistent, like a warning she couldn't ignore. Her stomach twisted. She'd seen that look before, in her husband's face the night he'd dismissed the engine's cough, the night she'd let him go without a fight. "Ellie?" Maggie's voice broke through, soft but sharp. "What's it doing?" Ellie didn't answer right away. She stepped from the helm, her boots splashing in a puddle, and knelt beside the bear, her knees protesting the cold wood. The marks weren't a map, not the detailed kind she'd studied in her father's charts, but they felt like a signal, a crude sketch of danger ahead. She traced a finger over them, her breath fogging in the chilly air. "It's telling us something," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. Hank snorted, crossing his arms. "It's a bear, not a damn navigator." But his words faltered as he glanced at the scratches, then at the water. Jimmy knelt too, his fingers hovering over the marks. "Looks like rocks," he said, his voice tentative. Ruth stood, her notebook clutched tight, and peered at the cove. "There's a shoal out there," she said, recalling a lesson she'd taught about coastal hazards. "Not on the charts, but I've heard stories. Shallow spots that catch boats off guard." Ellie's chest tightened. She knew the cove, had docked there 100 times, but she also knew the sea's tricks, the way it hid its teeth until it was too late. Her husband had trusted his charts, his gut, and it hadn't saved him. She'd trusted them too back then, and lost everything. Now this bear, this impossible creature, was clawing at her deck, its eyes begging her to listen. She stood, her legs shaky, and returned to the wheel, her mind a storm of doubt and memory. "Ellie, what do we do?" Maggie asked, her hand resting on the rail. Her trust in Ellie absolute. The crew turned to her, their faces a mix of worry and faith, waiting for her call. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, and stared at the bear. It pawed again, harder, the scratches deepening, its huff louder now, a plea she couldn't dismiss. She thought of that night, her husband's laugh, his hands slipping from hers, the waves closing over him, and felt a surge of something fierce, something she hadn't felt in years. "Change course," she said finally, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Steer left, around the point." Hank's jaw dropped, his skepticism flaring. "You're trusting a bear over your own charts?" he snapped, but he didn't move to stop her. Maggie nodded, her eyes soft with understanding, and adjusted the rudder. Jimmy grinned, his faith in Ellie unshaken, while Ruth wrote, her pen trembling. "Captain's call," she murmured, a note of awe in her tone. Ellie turned the wheel, the boat veering from the cove's mouth, skirting the rocky point instead. The bear settled back, its paws tucked beneath it, its eyes still on her, calm now, as if its work was done. They sailed in silence, the crew watching the water, the shore, the bear, waiting for proof or folly. As they rounded the point, a fishing boat appeared, its captain waving them down. "You dodged a bullet," he shouted over the wind. "Shoal's right where you were headed. Damn near invisible this tide. Took out a skiff last week." Ellie's breath caught, her hands trembling on the wheel. She looked at the bear, its golden eyes steady, and felt a chill that wasn't from the wind. It had known. Somehow, impossibly, it had known. And she'd listened. The crew exchanged glances, their silence heavy with wonder. Maggie touched her arm, her voice soft. "You were right to trust it," she said. Ellie nodded, her throat tight, her mind reeling with what it meant. The shore loomed closer, a safe harbor waiting, and Ellie felt the sea shift beneath her, whispering of trust repaid, of a bond forged in claw and wave. She didn't understand it. Not yet. But she knew they weren't done. Not with this bear. Not with whatever it had brought into their lives. The lighthouse keeper eased into the sheltered cove, the water lapping gently against the hull as the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange and pink. Ellie Harper cut the engine, the silence settling over the boat like a sigh after a long day. The bear sat near the bow, its fur drying in the late light, its golden eyes watching the crew with a stillness that felt almost sacred. They dodged the shoal, thanks to it, and the weight of that truth hung heavy, a thread tying them tighter to this creature that defied every rule they knew. Maggie O'Connell secured the lines, her hands steady but her mind racing. She'd seen the bear's warning, felt its quiet strength through the storm, and now it sat there, a guest they couldn't send away. Hank Sullivan leaned against the rail, his wrench dangling from his hand, his gruff exterior cracked by the day's miracles. Jimmy Carter hauled the last crate aboard, his grin softer now, his trust in the bear as solid as the deck beneath him. Ruth Delaney stood with her notebook, her glasses catching the sunset, her pen poised over a page she couldn't yet fill. Ellie stepped from the helm, her boots thudding softly as she crossed to the bear. It tilted its head, a low huff escaping its throat, and she felt that pull again, that connection she'd confessed to in the storm, the one that echoed her husband's loss. She'd told it about him, spilled her grief to its steady gaze, and it had stayed, fought with them, guided them. Now, with the shore so close, she wondered what came next, how they'd part with this piece of the wild that had become theirs. "We're here," she said, her voice rough but gentle, as if speaking to a friend. The bear shifted, its claws clicking, and rose to its full height, towering over her, yet calm, its presence a quiet force. Maggie joined her, her hand brushing Ellie's arm. "What do we do with it?" she asked, her tone soft, almost reverent. Jimmy looked up, his hand still on the crate. "We can't just let it go, can we?" he said, his voice small, a boy afraid to lose something precious. Hank snorted, crossing his arms. "It's a bear, not a pet," he said, but his eyes lingered on it, his doubt thinner now, worn down by the day's weight. Ruth stepped forward, her notebook tucked under her arm. "It's more than that," she said, her voice firm with a teacher's clarity. "It's shown us, over and over, we owe it something." Ellie nodded, her throat tight. She owed it more than she could say, for Jimmy's safety, for the engine, for the shoal, for pulling her from the shadows of her past. The bear moved then, lumbering to the edge of the deck where a broken plank lay, snapped loose in the storm. It pawed at it, its claws catching the wood, and began to carve, slow, deliberate scratches that formed a rough shape. Ellie knelt, her breath fogging in the cooling air, and watched as it traced a jagged outline, the boat's hull, 5 small marks for the crew, and a larger one for itself, linked in a crude circle. It finished, nudging the plank toward her with its snout, its eyes meeting hers, with a depth that stole her words. Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's us," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jimmy grinned, his eyes bright. "It's saying we're together," he said, his wonder spilling over. Hank stared, his wrench slipping to the deck with a soft clank. "I'll be damned," he muttered, his skepticism finally breaking. Ruth knelt beside Ellie, her fingers tracing the marks. "It's a gift," she said, her voice trembling with awe. "A thank you." Ellie took the plank, her hands shaking as she held it, the wood rough against her skin. She saw her husband in those marks, not his face, but his spirit, the way he'd linked their lives to this boat, this crew, this sea. She'd lost him to the waves, but this bear had brought something back, a piece of trust, a piece of hope. Tears stung her eyes, and she clutched the plank to her chest, feeling a weight lift, a forgiveness she hadn't known she needed. "Lower the ramp," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her throat. Hank moved to obey, his grumbling gone, his hands quick on the winch. The ramp thudded into the shallow water, a bridge between boat and shore. The bear stepped onto it, its bulk swaying, then paused halfway down. It turned, its massive frame silhouetted against the sunset, and raised a paw. A slow, deliberate wave that froze the crew in place. Ellie's breath caught, her heart pounding as she waved back, a reflex she couldn't stop. Maggie's hand found hers, squeezing tight, while Jimmy waved too, his grin wide. Hank lifted a hand, awkward but real, and Ruth clutched her notebook, tears slipping down her cheeks. The bear held the pose, a minute stretching into eternity, then turned and lumbered into the trees, its form swallowed by the dusk. The crew stood in silence, the plank heavy in Ellie's hands, the air thick with something unspoken. She felt the sea beneath her, its whispers softer now, promising a quiet night. But she knew it wasn't over. Not this story, not this bond. The bear had left them a piece of itself, a mark of what they'd shared. And as the stars blinked awake, she felt its absence like a friend stepping out of sight, not gone, just waiting. They'd return to the bay tomorrow, to the fish and the tides, but tonight they'd carry this gift, this goodbye, into their dreams, a light flickering in the dark, guiding them toward whatever came next. The lighthouse keeper. Bob gently at its usual fishing spot in Penobscot Bay, 3 days after the bear's farewell, the morning sun glinting off the waves like scattered coins. Ellie Harper stood at the helm, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, the carved plank tucked safely in her jacket pocket. Its rough edges pressed against her chest, a reminder of the creature that had stormed into their lives and left as quietly as it came. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, but her mind lingered on that final wave, the bear's silhouette fading into the trees. She felt its absence, a hollow space she couldn't fill with routine. Maggie O'Connell hauled up a net, her dark curls bouncing as she worked, her eyes scanning the horizon with a mother's quiet hope. She'd seen the bear as a mirror to her son, strong, steady, unexpected, and its departure left her restless. Hank Sullivan tinkered with the engine hatch. His gruff mutters a familiar hum, though his glances toward the shore betrayed a flicker of something softer. Jimmy Carter sorted the catch, his lanky frame moving with newfound confidence, his grin flashing whenever he spoke of the bear. Ruth Delaney sat with her notebook, her glasses catching the light, her pen tracing the memory of that carved goodbye. Ellie steered them through the familiar waters, the rhythm of the bay soothing her unease. They'd return to fishing, to the life they knew, but the bear had changed them, stitched them tighter, left a mark deeper than the scratches on that plank. She'd told them to keep it quiet, unsure how to explain it to the dockside gossips, but the crew's silence buzzed with shared wonder. The sea rolled beneath them, whispering of normalcy, until Jimmy's voice broke through, sharp and bright. "Look!" he shouted, pointing toward the waves. Ellie turned, her breath catching as a dark shape broke the surface. A massive brown bear, swimming with purpose, its golden eyes locked on their boat. It wasn't alone. Clutched in its jaws was a large clamshell, pristine and shimmering, and as it drew closer, she saw smaller shells tucked against its chest, their colors glinting in the sun. The crew froze, nets and tools forgotten, their eyes wide with disbelief and joy. Maggie dropped her rope, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's back," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Hank straightened, his wrench clattering to the deck, his skepticism drowned by the sight. "I'll be damned," he muttered, a rare grin tugging at his lips. Jimmy laughed, a pure boyish sound, and leaned over the rail, waving as if greeting an old friend. Ruth stood, her notebook slipping to her seat, her glasses fogging as she blinked back tears. "It remembered us," she said, her voice trembling with awe. Ellie cut the engine, the boat drifting as the bear reached them, its paws churning the water with steady strokes. It stopped beside the hull, its head bobbing, and nudged the large clamshell onto the deck with a gentle push of its snout. The shell landed with a soft thud, its pearlescent surface catching the light, a gift, unmistakable and deliberate. Then, one by one, it offered the smaller shells, each placed with care at the crew's feet. Ellie knelt, her hands trembling as she picked up hers, a deep green, the color of her jacket the day they'd saved it. Maggie's was blue, matching her cap. Hank's a rusty red like his shirt. Jimmy's a bright yellow, his raincoat's hue. Ruth's a soft gray, her sweater's shade. "It knows us," Maggie said, her voice breaking as she clutched her shell, her thoughts on her son's small hands offering treasures from the shore. Jimmy grinned, turning his shell in his fingers. "It's like it went shopping for us," he said, his wonder spilling over. Hank held his gruff exterior melting into a quiet nod. "Crazy beast," he muttered, but his tone was warm, almost fond. Ruth traced hers, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's a thank you," she said, her teacher's mind piecing together the impossible. Ellie stood, her shell heavy in her hand, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. She met the bear's gaze, those golden eyes steady and deep, and felt that thread again, the one that had pulled her from grief, tied her to this creature across storms and shoals. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice rough. The bear huffed, a soft sound that rippled through the air and swam a slow circle around the boat, its presence a quiet celebration of their bond. A shout broke the moment, another boat, its captain waving from the helm. "You seein' this?" he called, his voice carrying over the water. George Tanner, a grizzled fisherman with a laugh as loud as his doubts, steered closer, his crew peering over the rail. "Heard you pulled a bear out of the bay," he said, his tone half mocking. "Thought it was bunk till now." Ellie stiffened, her hand closing around her shell, but Maggie stepped forward, her jaw set. "It's real," she said, her voice sharp with a mother's protectiveness. "It saved us, meaning more than once." George laughed, a barking sound that grated on Ellie's nerves. "Sure it did," he said, leaning back. "Next you'll say it's your mascot." His crew chuckled, but their eyes lingered on the bear, curiosity cutting through their skepticism. Ruth pulled out her phone, her hands steady despite her tears, and started filming, the lens capturing the bear's slow swim, the shells gleaming on the deck. "Let them laugh," she murmured to Ellie. "This'll show 'em." The bear ignored the noise, its focus on the lighthouse keeper. It lingered, its head resting near the hull, its breath puffing in soft clouds. Ellie felt the crew's eyes on her, their trust a steady anchor, and nodded to Ruth. Keep rolling, she said, her voice firm. The video would spread, she knew it, whispered from boat to dock, a ripple of their story reaching beyond the bay. The bear had come back, not just for them, but to show them something she'd carry into the days ahead. The sun climbed higher, warming the deck as the bear finally turned, swimming toward shore with a grace that belied its size. Ellie watched it go, her shell a weight in her pocket beside the plank, her heart lighter than it had been in years. It wasn't goodbye, not really. It was a promise, a thread stretching into tomorrow, pulling them toward whatever came next. The lighthouse keeper rocked gently in Penobscot Bay, the midday sun blazing overhead, the water a deep blue that mirrored the sky. Ellie Harper stood at the helm, her hand steady on the wheel, the green clamshell tucked beside the carved plank in her pocket. The bear's return 3 days ago had lit something in her, a spark of wonder, a flicker of trust, and its gift still gleamed in the crew's hands, a quiet testament to their bond. She felt its absence now, a soft ache, but the sea rolled on, promising fish and routine to fill the day. Maggie O'Connell sorted nets, her dark curls tied back, her thoughts drifting to her son and the bear's steady strength. She'd kept her blue shell on the galley table, a treasure to show him tonight. Hank Sullivan oiled a winch, his gruff mutters a low hum, his red shell stashed in his toolbox like a secret he couldn't quite admit. Jimmy Carter hauled a crate, his yellow shell in his pocket, his grin flashing as he hummed a tune about their bear buddy. Ruth Delaney sat with her notebook, her gray shell beside her, her phone buzzing with messages about the video, already spreading through the docks, a whisper growing louder. Ellie steered them toward a fishing ground, the nets ready, the day unfolding as it always had. But the air shifted, a ripple breaking the water's calm, and Jimmy's voice rang out again. "It's back!" he shouted, pointing to a dark shape swimming toward them. The bear emerged, its golden eyes bright, its fur slick with water. And the crew dropped their tasks, their breaths catching in unison. It swam with purpose, its massive paws cutting the waves, and stopped beside the boat, its head tilting as if greeting old friends. Maggie smiled, her hands stilling on the net. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" she said, her voice warm. Hank set his wrench down, his gruffness fading into a nod. "Persistent critter," he muttered, a grin tugging at his lips. Jimmy leaned over the rail, his grin wide. "Hey, big guy," he called, waving like a kid at a parade. Ruth grabbed her phone, filming again, her glasses slipping as she murmured, "It's not done with us." Ellie cut the engine, the boat drifting as the bear circled them, its eyes sweeping the deck. Then it moved, splashing the water with its paws. A deliberate churn that sent fish darting toward the surface. Ellie's jaw dropped as it herded them, its motions natural yet intentional, driving a school of salmon straight into their nets. Maggie laughed, a sound of pure delight, and grabbed a net, hauling it up with Jimmy's help. "It's fishing for us," she said, her voice shaking with wonder. The net rose heavy, silver scales glinting in the sun, the best catch they'd had in months. Hank joined in, his hands quick on the ropes, his gruffness lost to the rhythm of the haul. "Never thought I'd take orders from a bear," he said, but his grin betrayed his awe. Jimmy whooped, his energy spilling over as he sorted the fish, his yellow shell bouncing in his pocket. Ruth filmed, her voice narrating softly. "March 31st, 2025. Our bear's back, and it's feeding us," she said, her tears blurring the lens. Ellie watched, her chest tight with something fierce. Pride, gratitude, a love she hadn't named. The bear settled beside the boat, its head resting near the hull, its breath steady as the crew worked. She stepped from the helm, her boots thudding softly, and knelt at the rail, meeting its gaze. "You're something else," she said, her voice rough with emotion. It huffed, a low sound that vibrated through her, and she felt that thread again, stronger now, a lifeline across the bay. Jimmy paused, his hands full of fish, and looked at her, his grin fading into something serious. "Can we keep it, Ellie?" he asked, his voice small, a boy's plea beneath his bravado. She shook her head, her throat tight. "It's not ours to keep," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "It's free. That's what makes this special." She thought of her husband, the way he loved the sea's wildness, and knew she was right. Jimmy's shoulders slumped, but he nodded, his eyes on the bear with a quiet understanding. Hank tossed a rope aside, his red shell glinting as he pulled it from his toolbox. He carved a tiny boat into the scrap of wood with his knife, his hand steady, then tossed it into the water. The bear caught it gently in its jaws, a playful nudge that drew a rare laugh from him. "Figured it deserved something back," he said, his voice gruff but warm. Maggie smiled, her blue shell a weight in her thoughts, a story for her son tonight. The haul finished, the deck brimming with fish. The bear swam a slow lap around the boat, its eyes lingering on each of them. Ellie felt the crew's quiet joy, their bond with this creature deepening with every moment. Ruth stopped filming, her phone heavy in her hand, and looked at Ellie. "This'll change things," she said, her voice soft. "People will talk." Ellie nodded, her hand brushing the plank in her pocket. "Let 'em," she said, her voice firm. "It's our story." The bear turned toward shore, its form cutting through the waves, and Ellie watched it go, her heart full. It wasn't just a visitor, it was part of them, a light in the bay that would draw them back, day after day. The fish piled high, the shells gleamed, and the sea whispered of more to come. A promise she'd carry into tomorrow, a thread stretching toward the next chapter of their lives. The lighthouse keeper rocked steadily in the familiar waters of Penobscot Bay. A year after the bear first swam into their lives, the late spring sun casting a warm glow across the deck. Ellie Harper stood at the helm, her hands resting on the wheel, the green clamshell and carved plank tucked in her jacket pocket, their edges worn smooth from months of touch. The bear had become a fixture in their days, appearing before storms, guiding them to fish, its golden eyes a constant in the shifting tides. She felt it now even in its absence, a presence that had rewoven the fabric of her life, stitching her grief into something softer, something whole. Maggie O'Connell coiled a net, her dark curls tied back, her blue shell a talisman on the galley table, a story she'd told her son 100 times. She'd seen the bear's strength mirrored in him, a quiet pride that steadied her through long days. Hank Sullivan oiled the engine hatch, his red shell stashed in his toolbox, his gruffness softened by the bear's steady returns. Jimmy Carter hauled crates, his yellow shell in his pocket, his lanky frame stronger now, his grin a fixture as he spoke of their guardian. Ruth Delaney sat with her notebook, her gray shell beside her, her phone buzzing with views, her videos of the bear a local legend, spreading whispers of wonder through the docks. Ellie steered them through the bay, the rhythm of fishing to comfort, though the bear's visits had turned it into something more, a dance between them and the wild. It came unpredictably, sometimes days apart, sometimes weeks, but always with purpose, A pawed warning before a squall, a nudge toward a hidden shoal, a splash to herd fish. The fisherman called it Penobscot's Light, a name Ruth had coined, and it stuck, a title that felt right. Ellie had stopped doubting it, stopped questioning the impossible. It was theirs, and they were its, a bond forged in storms and shells. The water rippled, a dark shape breaking the surface, and Jimmy's voice rang out, bright and sure. "There it is," he shouted, pointing as the bear swam toward them, its fur slick, its golden eyes gleaming. The crew paused, their tasks forgotten, their faces lighting with recognition. It carried nothing this time, no shells, no wood, just its massive self. But its head tilted high, its gaze urgent. Ellie cut the engine, the boat drifting as it reached them, its paws churning the waves with a steady beat. Maggie leaned over the rail, her smile soft. "What's it got for us today?" she asked, her voice warm with expectation. Hank set his wrench down, his gruffness fading into a nod. "Better be good," he muttered, a grin tugging at his lips. Jimmy waved, his energy spilling over. "Hey, big guy," he called, his trust unshaken. Ruth grabbed her phone, filming as she murmured, "April 28th, 2026. It's back and it's got purpose." Ellie stepped from the helm, her boots thudding softly, and knelt at the rail, meeting its gaze. "What is it?" she asked, her voice rough but gentle. The bear swam closer, its head dipping below the surface, then rising with a low huff. It turned, splashing the water with its paws, and swam a short distance before looking back, its eyes locked on hers. Ellie's brow furrowed, her hand brushing the plank in her pocket. It wasn't herding fish, its motions were different, insistent, a call she couldn't ignore. "It wants us to follow," she said, standing, her voice firm with a captain's resolve. Maggie nodded, her trust instant, while Hank crossed his arms, his skepticism thin. "You sure?" he asked, but he moved to the rudder without waiting for an answer. Ellie turned the wheel, the boat easing after the bear as it led them through the bay, its path cutting toward a rocky inlet rarely fished. The crew watched, their silence thick with curiosity, until the bear stopped, its head bobbing near a cluster of reeds. There, tangled in the shallows, was a young deer, its antlers caught in driftwood, its legs kicking weakly against the tide. Ellie's breath caught, her chest tightening with a memory. Her husband pulling a stranded seal from a net, his laugh echoing over the waves. "It's hurt," she said, her voice low, a plea echoing in her own words. Jimmy leapt to the rail, his grin gone. "We gotta help it," he said, his voice urgent. Maggie grabbed a rope, her hands quick, her mother's instinct flaring. "Careful now," she warned, her tone sharp but soft. Hank fetched a knife, his gruffness replaced by action. "Let's move," he grunted, his red shell glinting as he worked. Ruth filmed, her voice narrating softly. "It brought us to save something," she said, her tears blurring the screen. Ellie nodded, her throat tight. "Lower the net," she said, her command steady despite the ache in her heart. They worked fast, the bear watching from the water, its eyes steady as they maneuvered the net beneath the deer. It thrashed at first, its hooves splashing, but Maggie spoke to it, her voice low and soothing, like she'd calmed her son through nightmares. The net rose, the deer trembling within, and they hauled it aboard, its wet fur dripping onto the deck. Hank cut the driftwood free, his knife flashing while Jimmy held the ropes, his strength surprising even himself. The deer stilled, its dark eyes wide, and Ellie knelt beside it, her hands gentle on its flank. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. The bear swam closer, its head resting near the hull, its huff a soft approval. Ellie met its gaze, her shell heavy in her pocket, and felt that thread again, stronger now, a lifeline of trust. It had brought them here, not for fish, but for this, a life to save, a mirror to her own rescue a year ago. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough with gratitude. The crew gathered, their hands still, their eyes on the bear, its presence a quiet celebration of what they'd become. They released the deer at the cove's edge, its legs wobbly but sure as it stumbled into the trees. The bear lingered, its eyes sweeping the crew, then turned toward shore, its form fading into the dusk. Ellie watched it go, her heart full, knowing it would return, knowing it was their light, their guide, a promise stretching into the days ahead. The lighthouse keeper cut through the stormy waters of Penobscot Bay, 4 years after the bear's first rescue, the wind howling as dark clouds churned overhead. Ellie Harper gripped the wheel, her hand steady despite the squall's fury, the green clamshell and carved plank a constant weight in her pocket. The bear had woven itself into their lives, warning of storms, guiding to fish, saving the deer, and now it was a legend. Penobscot's Light. A name whispered from dock to dock. She felt it in her bones, a bond that had healed her grief, turned her crew into family, made the sea a partner rather than a thief. Maggie O'Connell secured a crate, her dark curls plastered to her face, her blue shell safe in the galley, a story her son now told his friends. She'd grown fiercer, softer, shaped by the bear's quiet strength. Hank Sullivan wrestled with a loose rope, his red shell in his toolbox, his gruffness a thin veneer over a heart softened by years of wonders. Jimmy Carter, broader now at 26, hauled nets, his yellow shell in his pocket, his grin tempered by a man's resolve. Ruth Delaney clung to her notebook, her gray shell beside her, her videos a viral thread tying their story to the world. Schools taught it, conservationists hailed it, a light spreading beyond the bay. Ellie steered through the swells, the storm a familiar foe, but the radio crackled with urgency. A distress call from a nearby boat capsized in the gale. "Mayday, mayday," the voice pleaded, static cutting through the wind. "We're going under 2 miles west of the point." Ellie's chest tightened, her husband's face flashing, his boat splintering, his hand slipping from hers. She'd failed him, but not this time. "We're close," she said, her voice steel, and turned the wheel, the lighthouse keeper plunging toward the signal. The crew sprang to action, their rhythm honed by years, their trust in Ellie absolute. Maggie grabbed life rings, her hands quick, her mother's instinct flaring for strangers in need. Hank rigged a tow line, his gruffness lost to the task, his red shell glinting as he worked. Jimmy checked the nets, his strength steady, his voice calling coordinates over the wind. Ruth filmed, her phone shaking, her voice narrating through the chaos. April 28th, 2029. "Storm rescue," she said, her tears mixing with rain. A dark shape broke the waves. The bear, its fur slick, its golden eyes piercing the storm. Ellie's breath caught as it swam beside them, its massive paws cutting the water, its head tilted toward the distress call's source. "It's here," she shouted, her voice rising over the gale. Maggie grinned, her fear easing. "It's with us," she said, her tone warm with faith. Hank nodded, his gruffness gone. "Damn right," he muttered, his hand steady on the line. Jimmy waved, his grin flashing. "Lead on, big guy," he called, his trust unshaken. The bear guided them, its path sure through the churning sea, leading them to an overturned skiff, its crew clinging to debris. Ellie maneuvered close, the boat rocking, and the bear swam to the wreck, its bulk a shield against the waves. It grabbed a tow line in its jaws, its strength hauling it taut as Hank secured it to the lighthouse keeper. "Pull!" Ellie shouted, and the crew heaved, their arms straining, the bear's power anchoring the line. The capsized boat righted, its crew scrambling aboard, their shouts of thanks lost to the wind. Ellie watched, her heart pounding, as the bear held firm, its eyes meeting hers through the spray. A partner in this fight, a light in the dark. They towed the skiff to safety, the storm easing as they reached the cove. The rescued crew, trembling but alive. The bear lingered, its head resting near the hull, its huff a soft triumph. Maggie knelt beside Ellie, her hand on her shoulder. "We did it. Together," she said, her voice thick. Jimmy grinned, his strength proven, while Hank nodded, his red shell a quiet badge of their bond. Ruth stopped filming, her phone heavy, and looked at Ellie. "This is bigger than us now," she said, her voice soft with awe. She'd written a book, The Light of Penobscot, its cover the carved plank, its pages taught in schools, its message carried by conservationists worldwide. Ellie nodded, her throat tight. "It always was," she said, her hand brushing the plank. The bear had saved them, saved others, turned their simple act into a legacy. The rescued captain approached, his face weathered, his voice hoarse. "That bear, it's real?" he asked, his eyes wide. Ellie smiled, a rare softness breaking through. "Real as the sea," she said, and he nodded, his crew whispering of miracles. The bear swam a slow lap around the boat, its eyes sweeping them, then turned toward shore, its form fading into the dusk. Ellie watched it go, her heart full, seeing gray in its fur, age creeping in, a mirror to her own years. She knew it wouldn't stay forever, but its light would, a thread stretching into tomorrow, a promise of more lives touched, more stories told. The storm had tested them, and they'd prevailed, not alone, but with the bear that had become their heart, their guide, their legacy in the bay. The lighthouse keeper floated steady in Penobscot Bay, 5 years to the day since Ellie Harper and her crew first pulled the bear from the waves, the morning sun rising in a blaze of gold over the horizon. Ellie stood at the helm, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, the green clamshell and carved plank in her pocket, their edges smoothed by time and touch. The boat creaked beneath her, a companion through storms and rescues, its deck worn but warm with memory. She was 73 now, her silver hair thinner, her step slower, but her hazel eyes still sharp, carrying the weight of a story that had reshaped her world. Maggie O'Connell sat on a crate, her dark curls streaked with gray, her blue shell a treasure her son, now grown, kept on his shelf. She'd found strength in the bear's quiet presence, a mirror to her own resilience. Hank Sullivan leaned against the rail, his red shell in his toolbox, his gruff voice softer with age, his hand still steady from years of fixes and faith. Jimmy Carter, 27 and broad-shouldered, sordid nets, his yellow shell in his pocket, his grin tempered by a man's pride in their shared legacy. Ruth Delaney stood with her notebook, her gray shell beside her, her glasses fogged with dawn mist, her book. The Light of Penobscot, a beacon in classrooms and conservation halls worldwide. Ellie steered them to the spot where it began, the water glassy, the air thick with the scent of pine and salt. The bear had become their legend, Penobscot's light. Its visits a rhythm in their lives, warnings before storms, fish herded to nets, lives saved from wrecks. It had grown older, its fur graying, its pace slowing, but its golden eyes never dimmed, a steady thread tying them to the wild. She felt it now, a pull in her chest, knowing this day, March 28th, 2030, would close their tale. A ripple broke the stillness, and Jimmy's voice rang out, soft with awe. "It's here," he said, pointing as the bear emerged, its massive form cutting the waves, 4 younger bears swimming behind it. Ellie's breath caught, her hands trembling on the wheel as it reached them, its head high, its eyes locked on hers. In its jaws was the original plank, scratched with countless tallies. Lives it had touched, a ledger of kindness begun with their rescue. The younger bears carried sticks, each carved with a rough mark of thanks, their fur dark and strong, their gazes steady like its own. Maggie stood, her hand on her heart, her voice thick. "It brought family," she whispered, seeing her son in their strength. Hank set his wrench down, his gruffness gone, a rare tear glinting in his eye. "Look at that," he muttered, his nod a salute. Jimmy grinned, his hands still, his pride swelling for the bear that had shaped him. Ruth filmed, her phone shaken, her voice narrating through tears. 5 years today. It's endin' where it started," she said, her legacy complete. Ellie cut the engine, the boat drifting as the bear swam closer, nudging the plank onto the deck with a gentle push. She knelt, her knees creaking, and took it, her fingers tracing the tallies, hundreds, maybe thousands, a map of miracles. The younger bears offered their sticks one by one, placing them at the crew's feet. Maggie's a jagged line, Hank's a crude boat, Jimmy's a fish, Ruth's a circle. Ellie's chest tightened, her shell heavy beside the plank, a final gift from the creature that had pulled her from grief. "It's saying goodbye," she said, her voice rough, breaking with the weight of it. The bear met her gaze, its golden eyes dimmer now, clouded with age, but still deep, still hers. It huffed, a low sound that vibrated through her, and she saw her husband in it, his laugh, his love, his light, reflected this wild thing that had saved her soul. "You did good," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks, cold against the morning air. The younger bears circled the boat, their heads high, their paws steady, a quiet handover of their mentor's watch. The bear swam to each crew member, its movement slow, its breath labored, and paused before Ellie last. It raised a shaky paw, a trembling echo of that first gesture 5 years ago, and she raised hers back, her hand trembling too. Maggie squeezed her shoulder, Jimmy waved, Hank lifted a hand, Ruth clutched her notebook. 5 farewells woven into one. It turned then, leading the younger bears toward shore, its form a silhouette against the sunrise. Halfway there it stopped, standing in the shallows, and faced them, its massive frame etched in gold. It raised both paws, one last wave, weak but sure, then sank back, its head bowing, as the younger bears flanked it, guiding it into the trees. Ellie watched it vanish, her heart breaking and mending in the same beat. Knowing it was done, its light passed on. The crew stood in silence, the sticks and plank heavy in their hands, the sea whispering a final note. Ellie sat, her legs unsteady, and pulled Jimmy close, his son, a toddler with his father's grin on her lap. "Listen, little one," she said, her voice thick, passing the plank to him. "Once we saved a bear, and it saved us, over and over until it lit the whole bay. Kindness doesn't fade. It grows like a fire in the dark." The boy clutched the plank, his small hands tracing the tallies, and Ellie smiled, her tears falling free. The bear was gone, its watch ended, but its legacy lived. In the younger bears guarding the bay, in Ruth's book, in the stories told from dock to classroom, in the crew who'd become her family. She looked at them, Maggie's warmth, Hank's quiet strength, Jimmy's pride, Ruth's wonder, and felt the sea settle, its whispers soft with peace. The lighthouse keeper drifted, the sun climbing high, and Ellie knew this was the end. A closing not of loss, but of light, a story sealed in wood and wave, a bond that would echo beyond her years. "It's yours now," she said to the boy, to the bay, to the world, and let the tide carry them home, the bear's glow forever in their hearts. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.